Welcome to Leadership-Adelics Season 2 Part 2. I'm Sebastian Fouillade. Join me every week to explore the intersection between deep spiritual experiences and leadership. Leadership in the sense of how do you manifest a better future for yourself, for your family, for your community, and for others. So join me every week as I interview guests who've had those hardships, those journeys, those heroes' journeys, and they share the insights that they've gained along the way. Insights meant to inspire us, meant to awaken us, meant to help us build a better future. In this episode, meet Shannon Dames. She's a professor and researcher at Vancouver Island University, a resilience health professional investigator, and the research and development director for the Roots to Thrive Ketamine-assisted therapy program. She's working to develop and study the combination of resilience development and psychedelic-assisted therapies within a novel outpatient mental health model. We discuss the role of community in the healing process and why the healing journey should start at the basement of your soul rather than at the top of your mind. Shannon talks about bringing together Western medicine and the indigenous ways of healing and working with the medicine of the land. She shares her own personal journey with ayahuasca. This is a fantastic interview. Enjoy and see you on the other side. Shannon, welcome to Leadership-Adelics. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, really good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm starting to do something new on the show here before we get too deep in your life and your journey, is pulling oracle cards. So for people watching, I'm using a deck called the Earth Magic deck here. And, sometimes in ceremonies or, when I was down in Peru, we would pull cards before the ceremonies to reflect on it. And it's really surprising what come out of it. So I'm going to do this right now with your authorization. This card is a card that my dog chewed up. This is the only card in the deck that my dog chewed up. And it actually doesn't come often. It's the wind card for activation. And on that card, you see a big, powerful cloud with a face, some sunshine in the back, blowing a strong current. And, actually, I pulled that card yesterday at the end of a show for myself. So I'm wondering, does that wind and activation and even that picture, what comes to your mind when you see that? And the bite from the dog.
Yeah, I don't know. I think part of me, I see in the blue, I see complexity, which kind of resonates. I feel like I live in activation, hopefully not just nervous system activation, but just kind of getting in the flow of where the energy is. And often I think even just looking at letting the light in wherever possible, which some days is not so easy, and other days it comes in spades.
Beautiful. You were just sharing before the call that you've had quite a busy week as well, so there's probably a lot of activation and current and energy flowing this week right now.
It's even this. I don't know if it's so much this week. It's been this year in a way, and learning to live life in a little bit. You go from being able to prepare for everything and having some space to organize and, even just walking into presentations and knowing what I want to talk about or say or do a slide set. And it's just gotten so spaceless that it's forced me to just trust that wherever I land, what needs to come through is going to come through. That doesn't always go well, especially if I'm nervous system activated, because I can't really get the things to come through because I'm blocked at the nervous system level. So those are the days that don't go so well because I've A, not prepared, and then B, I'm just locked down by my nervous system. So a lot of my practice is really to try and just stay as grounded as I can and get into the flow, get into the rivers that already have good currents, rather than getting stuck in the stagnant areas, which take a lot of treading water. So, So in a way, it kind of resonates.
I like that. You bring the flow is something that, when doing podcasts, you have to be able to do. And it's fun, even when running ceremonies or sessions, you have to be able to be present and go in the flow. because you don't always know what's going to happen, and you can be prepared for everything, and you're so attached to maybe a certain way of doing things that it actually might get in the way of accomplishing what you're
Totally.
trying to do.
Well, and I think sometimes in the West, we've been so conditioned to like prepare ahead of time to,
Yeah,
and it's so then when we show up and do the thing, there's no like act or inspiration in the moment, right? Because we are literally just
yeah,
doing the rehearsed thing that is often coming from the level of the mind. And we're kind of leaving the like embodied part of it behind. So I think there's like
yeah.
this, and showing up with absolutely no preparation and living in total chaos is not awesome either. There's a good balance there. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a balance, right? It's kind of it's funny because preparing for something like this is interesting. Like if you over prepare, sometimes your ego gets in the way of wanting to show you've over prepared.
Yeah.
And but like you have, sometimes it's helpful to know your guest and what places they want to go to, what places they might not want to go to. And I think even like in psychedelic sessions, you've got similar things. It's like screening people and understanding, well, where could I take them, but I need to be ready maybe to take them other places as well. So, can you talk a little bit about your work before we dive in on how you got there, and what's going on with you right now, and what's keeping you so busy?
Mm-hmm. So I live up in Vancouver Island, Canada. I work and live on the Sunemas First Nation territory. I'm very grateful to be doing so. And the hat I wear is I'm a professor at Vancouver Island University, and I'm a researcher for resilience, and now resilience and psychedelics. Um, and I also work with a nonprofit here to help on the psychedelic programming development, and working with resilience-focused communities of practice. That's kind of my specialty, and I do that through the university role as well. Yeah, and then I don't know if I'm going to keep going on, but yeah, I'll leave it there.
Oh well, there's the roots to thrive you didn't mention in that.
Yeah. So Roots to Thrive is the programming end. So I've kind of oversee a bit of a portfolio that's like service delivery through Roots to Thrive, which provides ketamine and psilocybin assisted therapy through a community of practice environment. We really believe that people heal in relationships, and particularly relationships of unconditional positive regard. So trying to remove that I pay a therapist to be there for me, and create an environment where people are actually leaning in without a condition, which is kind of the group orientation where peers are holding peers. And all of the team too is we call ourselves patient partners. So we really try and get to the same level, rather than having a power differential, which is really impossible. But we're trying to get there as best we can. So that's the service side and kind of the main principles there. And then I also oversee an education program at Vancouver Island University, which is launching in September. And it'll be the first accredited kind of whole package psychedelic education program here in Canada, which is pretty exciting for us. And then we're also developing a research institute at VIU as well. So it's kind of a three-prong approach to psychedelics, where the research and the service are really informing the education, and vice versa, right? So.
Oh. When I was looking at your background on LinkedIn and Roots to Thrive, it also said you developed the roots theory. And I'm curious, that term roots, how does that manifest itself, and how you approach those things, and why did you pick that term?
Yeah. So it's funny. Like, I'm not even sure exactly how that name got chosen. I think it kind of organically came together. The theory was really developed by, and it's a living curriculum. So it's developed by healthcare providers back from 2018. We've been running with this idea of like, how do we, so I'm a nurse by trade, and we have pretty high levels of burnout, as do many of the healthcare professional disciplines, and beyond. How do we like engage in resilience development, stress management, promoting thriving without just speaking to the mind. So many of our education systems, you go to a class and they tell you what to do, and then you spend the rest of your time feeling guilty because you didn't do the things you're supposed to do. And there's an overwhelming amount of self-help advice out there, which gets to a point where you just obligationally are ticking boxes and not even really doing things out of desire half the time, because we're just doing what we think we're supposed to do to fix ourselves, right? So this kind of idea of like, well, how do we do this a bit differently? Because I'm not totally sure that works well. So we really started looking at somatic. How do we like get people back into their bodies? A lot of our problems with burnout is that we kind of like live life above the neck, and it's a survival tactic, right? Like, who has time to feel? Who has time to like shut things down for a moment, let the emotions come up and out, to emote? God forbid we emote in the professional environment, which if we did, our vessels would be a lot clearer, right? We could get that noise out by actually expressing what's happening. So that was kind of a lot of where it is like, what if we created like a community of practice where people actually showed up honestly, were able to emote, and it was like this like-intentioned environment where we remembered what it would feel like to operate out of a whole person kind of framework, like mind, body, spirit, rather than the floating mind. So from that place, we've been working on different iterations, researching it. Does this work? And so one of the studies was on cognitive control and improving that. And how do we do that with these kind of communities of practice? And then it's all been cost recovery, nonprofit. Like there's never been a profit motive for this ever, and nor will there ever be. It's really about people leaning in and holding a common fabric. And whenever a new person comes on the team, they bring in their threads, right? So they might have a different angle, whether, coming with different hats from industry, or they might be a somatic energy practitioner or an acupuncturist, or, so they're just coming into the framework with a bunch of different perspectives and alternate ways of knowing. And there's a really big focus on indigenous ways of knowing as well, which we really believe is absolutely imperative to bring psychedelic-assisted therapies forward. The biomedical system is not prepared to do this in a good way. We don't have a good mind, body, spirit balance. So that's a lot of the Roots program, is really working together to bring in different ways of knowing so that we can like really optimize the healing environment.
Yeah. I mean, when I think of roots, I think about ancestry. I think about pulling from the earth, the ground. And that was one question I had, which was, when you look at ketamine therapy and psychedelic-assisted therapy, you've got the medical background with your nurse work. You've got other people on your staff that have medical backgrounds. How do you bring in, and what tradition do you bring in? Like, how do you pull in that indigenous knowledge in there? And how do you approach that? Because it's so hard as we're trying to scale, the psychedelic assisted therapy, to also have that trust also with, indigenous tribes to say, hey, we're going to pull this in from you, this tradition. Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I realize I totally didn't answer your question about the tree and why it's called Roots, but we could circle back to that at some point. There's always a bit of a very thin line around cultural appropriation, and us kind of settler folks are the first people to throw a stone in terms of when we think one of us is culturally appropriating, right? So I think there's a lot of sensitivities around it. And I think there are ways, right? Like to do it in a good way. And it's through relationship, like it's all through relationship, right? So for us, and not everyone, our area, we just happen to be, we have a lot of indigenous influence in this area. So we are fortunate in that way. We work with the local nation. So it's kind of a partnership of taking, we call it a two-eyed seeing approach, where we take the best of the Western biomedical approach and really make sure, that we're using ketamine and that kind of thing, right? So we need to keep the body safe and use the science to really make sure, we're doing things in a safe way, specifically on the physical front. And then we really work with the other eye on the indigenous ways of knowing, which are a lot more familiar with the kind of body spirit side of healing. So it's like bringing these two perspectives together in this kind of living curriculum, and how we right down to like each week we have a session with people, right? So it often involves, there's often an elder there, there's a teaching that comes from
Okay.
both the biomedical side and the indigenous side, so that people are really getting a well-rounded experience of both, which really helps with the preparation and integration on the kind of mind, body, spirit, like the whole piece. Yeah. So, and that kind of gets pulled into
Yeah.
their healing experience.
It's like, how do you even start quantifying in your research the impact of that? And do you even need to? I mean, there's a, it's like having an elder there, like for me is a fantastic experience. And how do you show the value of that from a research perspective so that more people see it?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure through the Western lens that's, yeah. And we're not even really trying, honestly. We're just
Yeah.
like, this is a fact. We need
Yeah.
both. In my mind, in terms of colonization and how, and I'll just speak to a personal experience. One of my first experience going down to South America with psychedelics, the shaman there were like, "You white people are crazy." And I was like, the first time I've like really heard that, I was like, yeah, we kind of are. Like, we're not the most balanced crew, like we run around and compete with each other. We live pretty individualistic life. We're generally as a species, we're lonely, totally disconnected. We have lots of anxiety that we can't quite figure out because our bodies are so noisy. We don't even know how to sort them out, and we go to other countries and get them all cleared out by people that live in these alternate ways of knowing and look at us and are like, yeah, that's not going to work, right? We just go back to our house and fill our bodies up again with all that noise. So I in my mind, I'm like, it's not actually responsible for us in the West to use these kind of like mind, body, spirit manifesting medicines and feed people the biomedical view. It's like that. It's not enough. And I don't even know if that's psychologically safe. I don't think it's psychologically safe. So for me, it feels imperative that we have more ways of knowing than we currently hang our hat on in the Western society.
Yeah. It feels very sterile to me that, just looking at the medical aspect as well and ignoring the tradition that's come before and some of those tools and the mystical and some of the stuff that science will have a really hard time even quantifying. Unfortunately, it just seems like when we're thinking about scaling, we've got all the systems to scale things, but it's like there's some conflicts there on how to approach it. But I do love like hearing people like bringing it together, and it's like having that relationship. It's very important because sometimes, I mean, it's hard. Like, how do you open that conversation? It's like. And I'm glad you found you're on the land. You've got the connections. It sounds like a terrific program. You touched about your past experience, so let's go there. Let's you're clearly a spiritual person, and I don't know what how you feel about me using that term. Some people have different ideas of what spiritual means. When did that journey start for you? When did that spiritual journey start?
I think I've always had a pull that way. It used to be manifest more religiously when I was younger. And now I think it manifests just more through curiosity and needing really and wanting, but needing to trust something outside of myself has been, I think, always an imperative piece for me. I like to control things. I really like to control things. So, and I can't live in that mind frame and feel somewhat liberated or, free of the monkey mind unless I learn to release and to trust something outside myself. So, I've never really felt there's a choice to not be spiritual and to live life with any degree of trust and surrender. So yeah, probably from a pretty young age. It's manifested differently throughout my life. Yeah.
And at which point did you cross path with plant medicine or that journey when you went down to South America? Like, because control is interesting when you start working with plant medicine too. So I'm really curious about that. How
Yeah.
that went down.
I grew up with a lot of trauma in my childhood, like substantial, like quite a bit, and really noisy body. And so I think for me, I've always been really curious about, and I've also, it's funny when people are like, oh, you should try this supplement or that supplement, like throughout my life, right? I'm like, no, those do not work on my brain, which, is just riddled with complex PTSD, right? So I've always been really curious on alternate ways, rather than kind of going to the pills, and knowing the stats on those, right? And I did go to pills, and they just flattened me right out. So I've always been interested in what that looks like. And I heard about early on when I was working as an emergency room nurse. It's funny how when we have really traumatized bodies, we often go to really traumatized work areas. It's like we like to feed it or something.
Yeah.
So I had heard about it, and it's taken me like 20 years to actually get there. But my first session with ayahuasca, which was my first psychedelic session, I felt like I had, like I was suffocating for almost the whole time. It was like I had something very, very heavy on me. And I remember reminding myself to breathe, like just take a big breath. Cause I just felt like I was so compressed. I couldn't even raise my chest to breathe. And it was kind of the first time I thought, like, I think I live like this. Like, I think I live in this state in a way, like I'm suffocating, and like in this very, very few choices, like very narrow. And it was like a physical manifestation. So it was kind of the first time I realized, like, okay, I think this is lifting the veil. This is like lifting the veil of things I can't normally see. And I am now physically manifesting it. And of course, that doesn't mean that I was like instantly changed, but it gave me a real insight into like, oh, I can't live life like that. Like, no wonder I'm so stressed out. And I'm like choiceless, it just feels hopeless. So it was kind of the beginning of a much longer journey, to really try and unwind, what's happening in the basement of my soul, essentially, that is creating that on the surface,
Yeah. And was that working with the Shipibo tradition healers and down in Peru?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Can you share the center you went to or the surroundings there?
Yeah, I went to Temple of the Way of the Light.
Okay, that's where I went.
Yeah, I think it's familiar. And honestly, I had no idea. I had nobody I knew. I just had no social circle at that point. I just went by myself. I looked things up on the internet, made sure there was good reviews. I ended up finding somebody to give me like a personal idea just to make sure I wasn't going to go. I had very young kids at the time, so I wasn't going to I can roll the dice without kids, but with kids it was. So did a little bit of homework, but really it was like, I felt like I was flying blind in a lot of ways. Went down there for 3 weeks, and had a really great experience. It definitely, it's not like it was a magic bullet and everything changed, because I, hopped right back into the boiling pot once I got home. But what it did was it gave me insights into what's really happening at the very root level of, rather than looking at life more from the figuring it out from the top down. And I think a lot of our system, I've been in the medical system forever, just as a provider, and especially working with trauma for many years. And this idea of like, we really tend to label things from the top, right? Oh, you have a disorder of this sort, or you're addicting to this, or, and we label every manifestation of it with its own little silo, and then we treat the symptoms. But it had never really occurred to me in like a felt sense kind of way that is a bit silly, well, because many of the things that are at the very root of our challenges would manifest differently in me than it might in another person. Like, I might choose another substance of choice, or go right to darkness, right? So that idea of like really working at the seed rather than at the foliage and the branches, it taught me a lot coming back. And especially as a medical provider, and in the mental health. I was like, I get why our system does not work very well, right? Like we're not getting to it. We're not getting into people's basements. We're caught up on the
Yeah.
top, and then we're like all the pills are treating the things on the top, but we're not necessarily
Yeah.
getting down into what is causing it to manifest in the first place.
Yeah. And you were an ER nurse at the time, right? When you were.
When I went down there, I was actually, I had just finished my doctorate, and I was focused on adult education and resilience. And instead of walking across the stage to get my degree, as I told my partner, I'm like, I have no interest in going and getting a little hat and a roll of paper. I would like to walk across Peru instead. I want to do it. So it was kind of my graduation present to myself.
Yeah, and the 3 weeks, if I recall, at the temple, that's really intense too. I mean, that's what, 9, 10 ceremonies. I don't know how they organized it back then, but
Yeah, it's like 7 in short order. Yeah, yeah.
7 in short order. Like, what was the most challenging thing for you as you went through that, and like, how were you kind of internalizing it as you were going through it? Because everybody has their own approach.
Yeah, I've never really been one, and I used to think it was because of trauma, but I'm not so sure now. But I have a terrible memory. I don't. It's like my brain does not hold on to anything that it doesn't think is necessary, which is a bit annoying when it comes to traveling, because I I remember things in like snapshots, and then I like forget the rest. And it's also can be annoying in terms of like a lot of people, they have these psychedelic sessions and they're like so caught on the story, like, oh, this happened and I made this connection, and and I'm like, that's not really, I don't know if I learn in that way in my body, nor do I see a bunch of visuals. Like I'm not, it's more of like this felt sense thing. So when I first did ayahuasca, it was just being in my body. And I know it sounds like really elementary, but I didn't realize that for so many years, like decades, I actually have never been in my body. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm sitting in my body. I thought I was sitting in my body before, but I was not. I've been like, so that was like the most magical part, was just realizing I could drop into my body, which my nervous system would never let me do previously. Right. It was just like too dangerous, too noisy down there, too much shame, fear, all those, scary things. So even though there was some really dark, difficult times, I was sitting in my body, and I made it through every one of those times. And I think the fear of what's down there is what was keeping my nervous system from letting me go down there. So when you just kind of ride it out and you're like, yeah, it's really freaking dark. It even kind of hurts in a lot of ways, but there's also this peace that comes with the medicine. There's like this confidence that comes where I'm like, okay, my worst nightmare is actually not that bad. I mean, really, it wasn't that bad, right? Yeah. So it enabled me to like get more comfortable for the first time, even just experience what it was like to just go down to the basement and sit there, even if it doesn't feel that awesome. And clearing out some of the stuff that's there just by feeling it, like just by feeling the things I've been so afraid to feel. It lightened me up. It allowed me to let it go. Like those things just needed to be felt. They're like wounds that needed to be felt so they could be healed and then released. So that was a lot of my learning. And it's not that I like went home and was just like in my body all the time. Like that's not how it works. My nervous system was well trained to not do that. But it gave me a reference point, right? Like, and I think some people have, I know some people have a peaceful reference point from their childhood, where they were, nurtured and there was unconditional positive regard, and they have, they were able to do what they wanted for like be kids and felt secure. And, and I did not have that reference point. And I think a lot of people don't, right? So it's like, you don't know what it feels like to be well-brained, and all your neuroses and all that is just normal. And you almost assume that everyone lives like that because you've never known anything different, nor would you know what it would feel like to be different. So for a medicine journey to take you to that place of a well-brained state where there's like inspiration and you're feeling into your body and your passions and your fears, and I think it can be transformative in and of itself.
How did that change how you help people in your work after that? like coming back and how you look at others?
Well, I don't think there's a bad trip. But it did help that when people are like, I had a bad trip. It's like, well, I don't know if any trip is bad. I think sometimes we go to darkness, and sometimes there's
Yeah.
sometimes there's something to sitting in the darkness, right? And like and cultivating a friendship with ourselves in that place, right? So and it can feel really lonely, and sometimes you got to like pull out a flashlight and create your own light in those moments, and even there, right? There's something for us. So and I think that's really how it's informed. When people are their expectations are mismatched to their experience, and there's all this disappointment and almost pushes them further into darkness because they had some expectations that it would be different. And it's like your body gives you whatever it's ready for and whatever it needs at that moment. And sometimes we need to go to the darkness before the light comes in, and
Yeah.
that's so I think it creates a bit of confidence to just help people understand that, like, once you get in the river, you just got to go with the current and trust that that current is getting you where you need to go. Even if the stories don't look great on the surface, like it's not about the stories and what you get out of it. There's a
Yeah.
trust that your body is doing what it needs to do to heal, like that inner intelligence.
Yeah, and that's another disclaimer I like to put in there. Is like, even though you shared your experience, and I've got many guests sharing their experiences, the temple is also, they're really good at reminding you of that. Is everybody's journey is very different, very personal, and just because Shannon had this journey and had this insights, and you might even have a similar upbringing as Shannon, it doesn't mean he'll have the same experience. And they talk a lot about intentions versus expectations. I remember at the temple they had a little copy of the Bhagavad Gita on the bookshelf in the community area, and I would read this beforehand, and there's a whole passage on that. And it's hard because in Western society we're so taught of expectations, like think with the end in mind. Yeah, and so when people go to those journeys, they expect the miracles and they expect this and that. And I'm like, first put in the work
Mm-hmm.
and start there. Um, did when you went to the temple, did they have this entire preparation document when you went there, like that? Because they're very thorough on how to prepare for the ceremonies, and I'm curious if that was already in place when you went there, and how that helped you.
Yeah, that's it. That memory thing I mentioned and the details, that
You
that
forgot.
one, that's gone. Maybe. I don't know. And I'm really bad at doing
Maybe.
that kind of preparation stuff anyway, so I'm sure I did the minimum. But
Well, it's funny because I had another guest Carlos Tanner, who works for the Ayahuasca Foundation, and we were talking about preparation, and he was like, "Well, it's a thing that comes from the Western society because you're flying down to Peru, you only have 2 weeks, and you have to make the most out of it. But really, if you lived in this community in the jungle and you were sick and you go see the shaman on that day, they're not going to prepare you for anything. They're going to give you your medicine and what you need."
mm-hmm.
And so it was interesting to get his perspective on that, of like, well, like, we created preparation to make the most out of time. Now there's some scientific reasons for maybe cutting down on some foods and certain things that wouldn't do well with the substance, but at the same time, sometimes it's very thorough. Sometimes, like, you follow a diet for like 2 months before you get there. um, and then it's funny because I've also worked with some indigenous tribes, and they'll have like pizza before they run the ceremony. They'll, because they're so used to working with the medicine, and so sometimes we tend to romanticize things. Um, and it's interesting, you talked about the shipibo, the maestro was telling you we're crazy. And I think we're probably crazy sometimes on how much of a pedestal we put them in, or how we see
Mm-hmm.
them, because they're human like us
Yeah.
too. And I don't know how much reflection you had around that, or as you got to know, or if you went through further journeys working with ayahuasca, and how your relationship evolved with that plant over the years and that tradition?
Yeah, it's fine. I haven't since my Peru experience, I have not gone back to ayahuasca. So it's and I have this. I don't know. By the time I was at that seventh session, and I think it's probably a lot of ego as well, but I could not like getting it down. I was like gagging. I like my body was
Oh
like,
yes.
no effing way. Like, no, 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 no. You are not putting that down.
Oh.
And they were kind of laughing. I had to like plug my nose and like get it. And I was still like, you know? So it's, so I have this like real, and I think a lot of times people say, oh, it's, you should really feel into whether it's the right time and does it feel right and whether you feel called to it. And for me, I'm like, my nervous system never thinks it's the right time ever to put itself down. Right. So it's like this. And that's where I kind of, even in the West, I think part of that too is like our control of trying to get things just right. And again, like, kind of like what you're in, I'm not even sure we can really trust that because our brains are not totally trustable, but the way they've been conditioned to rely so much on the ego. So, yeah.
Yeah. This is really interesting. I remember that. I remember at the temple, it's you get to the end and you're like, oh no, like you can't do it. You try to, and it's like some people say, oh, it tastes like chocolate. I was like, not any chocolate I've ever known. And it's really medicine. And, I don't know how it was at the temple when you were there, but like you'll also have like 4 to 5 maestros when we were there, like singing at the same time. Like it is really intense. And you have the jungle outside with the toads that are going, and all those noises, and like this is like hard work. And the temple is like very, like I compare it to like a spiritual hospital in the jungle. Like it's very serious, and it's like that toward the end. And they also start with a ceremony that, for me, so I do have some control issues as well. And so the first ceremony you do is the vomitivo. I don't know if they had that when you were there, but it's like you drink tons of lemongrass water, and you're supposed to throw up together, and it's supposed to cleanse you and everything. It doesn't always work. Mm-hmm. It didn't work for me. I'm not a person that purges this way. I use breath work. It comes out different ends, but not this way. And so I had a guy who was like, oh, no, keep trying, keep drinking. And I basically diluted all the salt in my body. We had a ceremony in the evening. I wanted to pee throughout the entire ceremony. I had a headache because I diluted all the salt. I couldn't throw up. But, so like there's interesting things that are very intense. And especially if, the throwing up might be a control issue. Anyway, you just took me right back there. Yeah. And I can't understand why you necessarily didn't, want to go back. And so what was that next step in your journey working with plant medicine or psychedelics as you kind of developed all that plans with Root to Thrive? I'm assuming it didn't end with ayahuasca. And there were some other things that happened.
In Vancouver, on Vancouver Island, I think it's a bit of a psychedelic mecca, I would probably say, in terms of there's been a huge underground, which I had no idea. I have, it's like you don't see it and you don't know it until you know it. And then it's like, oh my gosh, how have I not seen this? This is very, so, and it's been a lot of my interest in working above ground. And that's been, I've only ever worked above ground on the medicine side. I've not kind of dipped in that way professionally, but it's just really seeing a lot of the wisdom that's already been already been kind of cultivated in the underground within a lot of providers too that do have like actually registrations and whatnot in the overground, right? So, and knowing from somebody that, came from trauma with a very noisy body and realizing that this medicine did more for me than anything in the system has ever done for like 20 years. I felt like there was like an ethical imperative to really like dig in locally
Yeah.
and figure out like how do we expand our mental health toolbox in a way that isn't culturally appropriating but really honors these medicines of the land and medicines that people, indigenous populations, have been using since time immemorial. So and with that, I'm yeah, it's always a bit sensitive talking about the personal stuff because of the criminalization of all of these, which
Yeah.
honestly is I think it's a bit ridiculous that they are criminalized and that people actually have to go break the law to get medicine that is safer than aspirin. Like
Yeah.
the moral distress, and even that we are putting on providers who are going to use these illegally because it's the only option they can see that will work for their client that has tried everything else. There's a lot of, I think, moral distress that we're layering on top of that population as well. So yeah, that's kind of was the catalyst for a lot of my work, was
Yeah.
finding people locally that are already like experts in many ways, have been doing this work for years, on at the
Hmm.
very place I lived, which was totally blind to that. And then starting to make the connections in the system around like, can we bridge this? Can we protect these people who are experts? And that we need them to come above ground because we have a lot to learn from what they already know. So it's been a lot of that, is figuring out how to bridge systems and how to kind of keep people safe in the meantime. Yeah.
Yeah. In Canada, do they have the equivalent of like the protection they have here with the Native American church, where they can perform ayahuasca ceremonies here through the Native American church, as well as peyote ceremonies? So there's a little bit of room. There's the Santo Daime here as well. Like, how does Canada approaches that?
Yeah, we are. Well, I think we are getting there. Not sure we're getting there in a great way, but we don't. At the regulations table, I'm yet to see Indigenous people invited to the regulatory tables when it comes to
Mm,
psychedelics here
that's
in
a shame.
Canada. I'm yet to see a voice coming from that, and it's not that Indigenous people. I think they should not have to ask permission ever to use any medicine of the land. Like I have no, yeah, I don't even understand how we can try and ban them from using medicines of the land, when they are on their own land, but we have done that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of we have a lot of work to do in this area, not just for the biomedical fields, but also like how do we really honor these First Nations that are lost a lot of these medicines in the colonization process, right? Like we took them away in a lot of ways when we criminalized them. So even a lot of the knowledge has been lost at our hands as settlers, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think we have a lot to do in terms
Yeah.
of like even helping them reclaim. I don't know if that sounds
Yeah.
or just enabling them. That's better than helping them to kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
reclaim those teachings, rather than and giving them the choice whether or not they take that choice or not. I think that should be their choice to have.
Yeah. I know I've really appreciated their knowledge and experience and the ceremonies that I've been part of. And the other thing I appreciate is the sense of community and connection to the earth, but also connection to each other that they can bring. That is essential when you go through such a spiritual journey. I wouldn't even necessarily just tie it to psychedelics. It's like we're also missing a lot of that in society right now, and we could learn from their approach and their community building, and how they run the ceremonies and support each other before and after. Um, so I hope that in the work that you do, you can show, like more people the benefit of that, and people can learn from this and use that as an example of like how can we take that, from coast to coast in Canada, not just on Vancouver Island, and maybe start there and show that, hey, yes, you have the protections in the US, but in Canada, maybe you can do something bigger. and I also appreciated what you were saying about maybe losing some knowledge, because I was talking with a friend of mine in Canada. I was working with a First Nation, and right now they're like, oh, well, there's some First Nation land. We could have a retreat center there. And I'm like, well, but do they still have healers? Do they still have people who can actually, help and bring the tradition in there? And it's not necessarily an easy answer, or it didn't feel like an easy answer for me as well. It was like, well, we have some land and we have some exemptions, so we can lose the land for that. But I was like, well, that's one thing, but it's not like we're building a casino here. It's like, like the traditions, like we want that involvement. We want to start, learning from the First Nation and from the healers that they have, that can really help us more than just in our personal journeys. Probably we can learn a lot from leadership as well, and how we manifest a better future.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Thank you. I know you have a hard stop in a few minutes, and there's so much I wanted to talk about, but I want to respect your time. I know you're very busy. There's one question I asked: if they were to capture the essence of leadership in a totem, in an animal, or in a plant, and I've got some examples, what would it be? And one example is the mycelium network. Another example might be flying geese. I had a guest talk about the wolf and the wolf packs. I'm curious if you have anything that pops up.
Yeah, well, I'm staring right now at an arbutus tree, and I love arbutus trees. I've and the Roots to Thrive. The name came from this idea that, like, we are much like trees. So, the depth and security of our roots really impacts the kind of felt sense of security with the weather that's happening around us. And when we see ourselves in a forest of trees rather than an individual tree on like a field, that felt sense of community in our body is exactly what we would call secure attachment. Right. And when we're securely attached, which is like a foundation for like mental health wellness, we live with a certain degree of confidence and ease on the surface. Right. So I look at arbutus trees in like a forest of trees, and they don't follow the rules. Right. They're like often a different color. They shed differently. They even look differently when they die. They often weave around in the forest, like they're more whimsical. And I really kind of see as like the art, right? Bringing in the inspired art in the forest and the creativity and whimsicalness of the arbutus tree, I feel like is also, in a way, it's kind of like leadership. It's stepping out, it's being different, and not being afraid to be who we are, not being too colorful or too much, not feeling like we have to fit in. So it's kind of like a more inspired way of being in a forest that might otherwise look more of the same.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was beautiful. I really appreciated your time today. I'll put links to, the Roots to Thrive in the show notes. And thank you so much, Shannon.
So such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please subscribe to it on Apple Podcasts. Follow me on Instagram at Leadershipadelics, or stop by my website and say hi at fooyad.com. That's FOOYAD. There's a lot going on. I've got a retreat coming up in October. I've got Flute Fridays, and I'd love to hear from you all, the listeners that tune in every week. And if you have suggestions for future guests, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm there, and I'd love to get more guests on the show. Thank you. Have a great day.